So hello, everybody, and we are welcome today on our program, our guest, the political advisor, Jason J. Smart. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm finally glad to meet you personally, and it's hopefully it will ease our conversation.
Sure.
I'm fine, thank you. So how do you feel actually in Kiev? Do you feel safe?
Yeah, of course. I mean, let's be honest, Kiev is quite safe. I mean, I think that statistically it's still much more dangerous, the driving and the accidents than anything else. I mean, yeah, it's very safe here.
Even if you hear all these alarms all the time, it doesn't scare you?
No, I mean, there's the alarms, but I think that the reality is that, you know, it is a very safe city. Even in spite of Russia's best attempts to make it not a safe city, it remains a very safe city.
Hopefully it will remain the same, but let's start with the question that I asked to your colleague from Italian Political Science Institute, Natalie Tocci. I talked lately, and we have a lot of talks about Ukraine and Russia, and it's obvious why. But it was interesting for me, what is the view on the situation and how it changed the attitude of politics and of audience inside the European Union from her point of view, affected by this war. So I want to ask you how it changed the attitude of politicians in the United States and the society. About society, we'll talk later. Do you have the view of any changes in political attitudes, and what are they?
I mean, since the war started, I mean, there's always been a change. When it initially started, of course, things were very, very favorable. There was a lot of outrage about what's going on. And I don't think that anyone's changing their opinion and become pro-Russian, but I think that there has been a change in the level of intensity that people are following the situation in Ukraine. When it first started, it was the top story every single day in every newspaper and every television show. Today, it is lessened, but it doesn't mean it's become less important. I think that it remains a very important issue. It's still one of the top political issues in most of Europe and in the States for sure. But it's now, I think, just a lot of, time has passed. Other things are happening. The United States will have elections in a couple weeks. And so, the focus is much, it's just naturally occurring that, the focus changes over time.
If we talk about audience, it's very interesting what are the main problems and what's troubling the Americans today, except for Ukraine and election in the United States. What are beyond all the top messages in the newspapers and TV shows to understand for us? Because we heard a lot of, everybody's talking about Ukraine. 85 or 87% of Americans agree to give money to the Ukraine and help with weapons and everything. So where these numbers come from?
Well, there is still, very high interest. That's certainly the case. There's tremendous support. I was in the U.S. Just a couple weeks ago, and the amount of U.S. flags you would see everywhere was surprising. It's the first time I've gone to the U.S. since the war began. And I was really, really surprised that, in Washington, D.C., in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., it was quite often you would see Ukrainian flags, which is, I don't remember once in U.S. history, historically, I can't even think of an example, of when someone else's flag was so commonly bought and then hung outside of the houses of American citizens. So there is, trust me, a huge amount of interest and concern for what's happening in Ukraine.
It's, again, tells about this, what we call the era of post-truth that is going on in our society. And it doesn't change the points of view of people as we can observe, because even I didn't know, even in Oxford Dictionary, there's the concept of post-truth. And in this post-truth explanation, they remind the referendum of Britain's Brexit from the European Union and the presidential election in 2016. So from your point of view, this post-truth era goes on, and what is it, actually?
I'll be curious how they define it. I'd be very curious what the dictionary says. But in short, I think that the era that we're dealing with here is, it is worrying some that there is a sense in the population that what is truth and it's individualistic, that there is no one truth, that depends on the person and their own perception what is true. And what the problem with this becomes larger is if everybody believes that and there's no longer facts, but you have your facts and I have my facts, well, one, it's not rational, it's illogical. The fact is that most things are factual and you can be proved one way or the other. It's not subjective. But unfortunately, I think a lot of people enjoy subjectivity, where they can have an opinion that's contrary to others despite the overwhelming evidence. And it gives them a sense of, I don't know what they feel like, special. They feel special. That they can have an opinion that's not correlated to anything in reality, but that it's taken seriously by some. And that's sort of crazy.
Actually, it started with the new level of technical revolution when internet was invited and new rounds of development. But as we see, this informational technology has also become a punishment for humanity. So you have a lot of access to the information, but the way you use it, it shows what's going on in the world. So in this situation, how do you think this complete neglecting of professionalism around the world will bring the society or the people to degradation, or it may be improved somehow? And who may improve it?
I think that, unfortunately, there is a degradation in knowledge in society. Before, where we'd look at, for instance, I set the example of the encyclopedia, which was commonly bought before, and people had encyclopedias, and they would check things and reference things if they didn't know. And now, unfortunately, when people can Google, and you can read a website that has completely whatever some guy thinks posted there with no sort of citation, just simply listing meaningless comments of his, then it is a threat to society that people are taking seriously these sorts of things. And we've seen before that the rise of things like conspiracy theories amongst people, which have no base whatsoever, can be significant. And they can really be destabilizing even for an entire country if the whole population believes it. And that's a problem when you're dealing with something where you're not dealing with facts, we're not dealing with a common set of things that we can agree on, but rather every person individually chooses what is real or unreal. It does create the real potential for an entire swath, entire group of this population to become obsessed with things that are false.
Actually, maybe this is the good example what happened during 20 years in the Russian Federation, how collective Putin appeared in the Russian Federation, and he is the joker on the global scale right now. Do you think this is the only one joker, and to which point this joker can bring us?
Well, I think that there's, one of the, I think the most worrying things, if we were to talk about this idea of truth and what it is that it's very easy for someone such as Russia Today, literally Russia Today, the channel, but Russia, the country itself, to use this to manipulate populations, this misinformation, this disinformation, I should say. Mm-hmm. And this disinformation is very, very important because, once again, if you have a solid, the case of Ukraine is a great example. Russia illegally invaded Ukraine. It's that simple. That's all that happened. Russia invaded Ukraine. But if you read the Russian press, somehow it never says that, does it? It never says Russia has invaded Ukraine. It never says there's a war even with Ukraine. Yeah, there's just simply a special military operation. Yeah. And the number of people in the West that believe that, fortunately, is not such a big number, but there is a sizable number, millions and millions, tens of millions of people who really believe that. They really do believe that Ukraine was an aggressor against Russia, and this was forced. And why do they believe this?
Why?
Because of Russian propaganda, but also I think it's the fact that there's this entire thing that you have your truth and I have mine. Then even if I can prove to you demonstrably, and it's very clear that all the facts on the ground, it's very clear that there was in Bucha a massacre, an Irpin. It was very clear that Russia is occupying illegally against international law territories of Ukraine. It's very obvious that Ukraine was not a direct threat to Russia in any real sense, or any sense at all. And so why then do they believe this? And it's because I have a hypothesis that a lot of these people choose to just be different, to be contrarian than the rest of the population. And if everybody is supporting Ukraine, everybody can look at the facts and say that obviously, look at the photos of Bucha, it's very clear what happened there, or Irpin, it's very clear what happened there. But they believe crazy things that it was fake, that it was actors. And this is absurd because, I mean, listen, there's hundreds of journalists that were there after it was released, opened, or I should say liberated. And it seems clear to everybody, no, those were real people, real civilians that got killed. So how could you possibly argue with this? Because they're just, I think, trying to be contrarian, trying to be different, and they're desperate to defend Russia for whatever reason that is. Either they don't like the West or whatever, they try to defend Russia to a point that's absurd. And I think we see the natural absurdity in situations like we do today in Ukraine. The arguments that Russia makes and everything else, or the people that support Russia make, are completely irrational.
First, this inflation depends on the amount of money that's thrown by Russian Federation among the world in the propaganda, or in the ways of this propaganda. I mean, all the time we say that Russia is limited more and more in money, in possibility to earn money from energetic resources and others. But we still see that people get this information somehow. We see the closing of Russia Today, we see the closing of different other propaganda channels around the world, but still, somehow they get these messages. How it happens? It's the matter of money or the matter of instruments and how this twisted information is given to audience?
So I think it's a few factors, and I think that it's most important to note that where Russia Today is the most effective is where there's less of a market of media. I think that if you're somewhere like the United States, why the U.S. doesn't limit Russia Today is because there's not a lot of, viewership is not that big to begin with. It's quite limited. And the fact is that there's a lot of options to watch in the U.S. We have tons of TV channels. So why would you specifically choose Russia Today? You could, but it's not very common. Now, where Russia Today is effective is in Latin America and Africa and other places that are developing. And why is that? Because the quality of the television itself, if you watch Russia Today, the quality of production is high. It's attractive. It doesn't look bad. It doesn't look like it was filmed in a garage. Whereas a lot of major TV stations in developing countries do look like that. They do look like low quality. And I've worked in Latin American television before, and I say this with sincerity, is that, yes, I realize that there's a problem with that. The fact is they are able to take advantage of that, to be sort of shiny and new and cool looking. And so if it's really cool looking, it must mean they're also telling the truth. And so people watch it, and there's no competition, unfortunately. I mean, there is like Voice of America and things like this, which are far less popular. They don't have something equivalent to what we have here in the former Soviet states. Real time, these sorts of programs are not common down there in Latin America or in Africa. But what they need really is to have more of the truth so people can contrast what's going on in that. And that's why I think it's important for Ukraine to also be, the programs like this that are in English are important, but I also think it'd be good to have them in French and in Portuguese and in Spanish and other languages so that the rest of the world can understand the truth of what's going on here is not subjective, it's facts. And what's happening in Ukraine, there's no two different arguments. There's only one thing that's happening. And what Russia is saying, you don't have to be confused. They're lying. Just understand Russia is lying because that's what they've always done. And so what we are communicating here is obviously the truth of the situation in Ukraine. Ultimately, people have to make a decision that's rational. I mean, if somebody wishes to see something that's crazy, they're going to find that crazy thing all they want. And I guess the equivalency would be if we look at something that seems completely irrational, like conspiracy theories. And there are millions of people that believe tens of millions of people that believe conspiracy theories. And yet their perception is that that is real. And the problem with the perception is it's reality. If you really believe that's the case, for you it is. And I think in the case of like a scary example of where you see this in a large scale is look at Putin's, him and his circle. I think that they sincerely, in their heart of hearts, truly believe, one, they believe they're justified. That's clear. They really do believe that. But they also believe these sorts of crazy things. I think they sincerely believe that Ukraine is not a state, that Ukrainians want to be part of Russia. I think that he sincerely believes this.
And he stated it in his articles and his speeches openly.
He really believes this. I mean, and he hasn't been to Kiev recently because I don't think he'd get the same reaction if he were to ask people. But in his mind, this is real, and they sincerely believe it. And as crazy as it seems to us, the fact is, world history does have this happen a lot. As we know, the Nazis were obsessed with the occult, and they had very strange Gnostic sort of beliefs. And you say, it's crazy. They didn't really believe that, did they? No, they really believe that. In the case of Putin, they really do believe this stuff that we read about that we think is absurd. For them, it's reality, and it's very worrisome.
But I cannot understand how some sort of politician around the world do believe what Putin writes in his articles and say in his speeches.
So it's a good question. I think that there's different levels. I think there's those who, for whatever reason, had a certain attachment to Russia as a country, or the Soviet Union before that, especially those on the far left. And for them, there's an inherent bias in favor of Russia. They try to find a way to justify Russia, which is absurd because there's no tie between Russia and Soviet Union. I mean, the economic principles or anything else, there's nothing in common. So, but why do they come to this conclusion? Who knows? But they are following a policy that would support Russia because they wish to support Russia. But I think there's another element to this, which the FBI announced a few weeks ago. which is that there's evidence now that Russia has financed political parties in more than a dozen countries. And I think that the actual truth, if we really get into it, is, and I'm not saying anyone specifically, but I think that if a lot of these politicians were being investigated further, how their parties were financed and how their political campaigns were financed, we might find that there's a Russian hand in this, which would explain their support as being more than just ideology, but simply an economic factor that drives them to do it.
What the role of politicians in the situation that's right now here in Ukraine, the war? I mean, and can these politicians improve the situation? Those one who did it.
Can politicians improve? Well, you know, the fact is that, yeah, I mean, inflation can be dealt with, but typically it's an unpleasant process. The fact is that inflation usually, I mean, in real terms, people feel it. They feel inflation. It's something that, out of all the things that can be bad happening in your country, one of the things that polling would indicate people worry about the most, de facto, is inflation. As you see your salary disappearing, you see that your buying power changes, and it's worrisome for a country that has high inflation. Unfortunately, the United States is dealing with high inflation. Europe is dealing with high inflation. And so what do we look at, and I think what we're going to see soon, is that there's probably going to be a lot of votes in elections to vote for more candidates and more leaders that are opposed to the governments who introduced the inflation, let's say, through their economic policies by printing too much money. But besides this, I think that we will see a rise, most likely, of populist right-wing parties, because they typically are the ones historically that gain the most from inflation. Now, left-wing parties could too, but it's usually the populistic ones on the right that I think that are probably going to win this time around.
Except for sanctions, there's the question of giving the weapons to Ukraine, and this is the one of the arguments between the parties that are before election that have different views. Yes. So talking about security and about giving the weapon to Ukraine, this question is interesting not only for the United States, but this question is interested for some Western European countries to give or not to give Ukraine weapons. What is the international system of security should or will look like after the end of the war?
I mean, I think the reality is that, you know, Ukraine is in a situation right now where it's still going to be the recipient of a lot of positive support from the West, from the United States, as well as from Europe. Yeah, I agree with you totally that there's some countries in the West, namely Europe, specifically I mean Europe, who have been sort of less than impressive in how they've wished to help Ukraine. They've delayed huge amounts of time, and that is unfortunate because the fact is it's costing lives. And they very incorrectly state that somehow that's going to help end the war sooner, which is absurd, or somehow that's going to, you know, it'd be a provocation, or worse than the war to send weapons. It's absurd. The fact is this, is that the sooner that Ukraine wins, the sooner that Ukraine is able to force the Russians out, the sooner the war ends. So if you want peace in Europe, the best thing you could actually do is get more weapons to Ukraine faster. Because the faster that we get the Russians out of here, the faster this will all be done.
One more danger that politicians and experts say can come from China. If it's not from Russian side, but from China, because they can worsen the situation entering Taiwan. How do you see China is ready to risk everything?
So that's a good question. I mean, when we look at the fact that Xi was reelected now the third time, or I can't say elected, but for the third term, he's going to be he's going to be there for now again. And what's that show? I think that he really is tightening his autocratic rule of the country. And why I find that to be concerning is that I think he is on the road to becoming much more dangerous than he's historically been. And I think that that will eventually spill over on Taiwan, unfortunately. When that will happen, you know, I don't know. But I will say that there are the signs that he would do something like that. Not today, not tomorrow, but sometime in the near future, yes, quite possibly so. And I think it would be incredibly unwise of China if they do go that route, because they've seen the economic sanctions that Russia's suffering and everything else. But, you know, I guess if we were to play the devil's advocate, the other side of this would be, no, he's probably not going to do it. And the reason is he sees the economic sanctions. China has not violated the U.S. sanctions against Russia. And the reason is simple, is that they realize it's not something they want to get involved in. And I think that he would, if he's not going to even support Russia now, then I doubt that Xi or the Chinese would want to, just a few months from now, start a problem with Taiwan and be in the same boat as Russia.
We talked almost about every participant in all these global processes that can affect the situation in Ukraine. So let's get back to Russian Federation, almost the end of our conversation. what should happen to Russia for the war to end, and who can influence it, and more of this. Endlessly, you cannot give the weapons and put sanctions, weapons and sanctions. It cannot be for years.
No, it can't be forever, but at the same time, I think that it can go for long enough to end this war. The fact is that Russia is a country that is in decline. We've seen that jets have crashed recently, more airplanes are crashing. We don't know the reason yet, but I assume that the lack of maintenance is a significant factor. And as Russia continues on this road, every day is going to get harder. Every day there's less car parts. Every day there's less airplane parts. Every day there's less microchips. Every day there's less computers. And so as long as Russia wants to continue playing down this route, we can go for a few years like this. But Russia itself, I don't think economically can. I do think that Putin might be doing something that will, in the end, lead to his own downfall.
They lose the computers, they lose microchips, but they somehow get Iranian drones or...
And they get so they lose computers, they lose all technology, but they get Iranian drones, which total value of street manufacturing is around $3,000 or less, but they're being sold them for about $100,000 each by the Iranians. So yes, that is what they have as far as technology goes.
About strong Ukraine, let's look a little bit in the future. Is the world really ready to spend all this money, to give everything of their abilities to make the new strong Ukraine on the geopolitical map? And what place this Ukraine they are ready to accept? On what place, let's say?
No, I think that the fall of Moscow, which is...
It's a competition between the countries, but let's be honest.
So you don't receive anything, you have to take it. So what I think is going to happen, though, is that Russia is in decline, in significant decline, and I don't know how it's going to get out of that. But let's imagine while it's in decline, I think this does open up a lot of opportunities for Ukraine. Once again, across the former Soviet states, all the parts that Russia used to be a major player, Central Asia is an example thereof, I think there's a real chance. I think that a lot of dictatorships in Central Asia, for instance, once Putin falls, they will fall as well because they're tied to his regime. And I think in the case of Belarus, once Putin falls, I think everybody thinks that Lukashenko will also fall. And I think this will allow Ukraine, which is by population the largest of all the countries I just mentioned, it has the real potential to become a powerhouse economically, especially as it moves closer to the European Union. And that will allow Ukraine to project into areas where it hasn't historically, not just north to Belarus, not just east to Russia, but even further east to the Central Asian republics.
And last question is just going back to the very beginning of our conversation about blindness of some politics that could stop some process. Everything could be avoided. So how you see, everything can still be avoided now? And if not, what will be the next shock of the post-truth era?
I think that the fact is that we've learned an important lesson in the course of Russia. Unfortunately, it came a little too late, is that a lot of people have said that Putin is dangerous and he was going to take this direction. And unfortunately, a lot of people in the West didn't want to believe that. They wanted to believe that, he would stop at this point. He would stop after Georgia. He would stop after he took Crimea, stop after Donbass. And obviously that was not the plan. I mean, Putin very clearly has plans to keep expanding Russia. And so I think it's important now that there is this understanding of that fact with most of the countries, not all. And with those countries that do understand it, though, I think there's firm resolve that this time that they cannot repeat history. This time we have to actually stop Putin.
We still have a lot of work to do.
Oh, yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for our conversation. So I will remind our audience that we talked to Jason J. Smart, the political advisor, and hopefully we'll meet soon and talk about more useful decisions of politicians globally.
Sounds good.
Thank you.